The Concordance Summit was supposed to be a turning point for peace, not a slaughterhouse. But the Viridian Death Squad had one objective: drag Princess Selene from the diplomatic annex and execute her on live broadcast. They laughed at the lone human attaché who begged for mercy, trembling under 100 pounds of colorful ceremonial robes. That laughter died in their throats when Elias Vance stopped shaking. Because those weren't robes, they were military-grade exo-webbing, ablative armor, and enough kinetic charges to turn a close-quarters ambush into a one-sided massacre. His name was Elias Vance. For 3 standard years, the galaxy dismissed him as a frail, perpetually exhausted protocol advisor, drowning in ornate ceremonial robes that made him stumble under station gravity. But that image was a weapon. Elias Vance was a retired Terran orbital drop shock trooper, a close-quarters specialist who had spent a decade clearing hostile ships with nothing but a pulse knife and a bad attitude. And the 100 pounds of cultural gear he wore were actually military-grade exo-webbing, ablative armor, and enough concealed kinetic charges to level a bulkhead. The Viridian Dominion had just made the last mistake of their lives. The summit was called the Aurora Concordance. It was the 47th attempt to end the bloodiest war the galaxy had ever seen. For 32 standard years, the Viridian Dominion had clawed through Allied systems territory, leaving 12 billion dead across 17 contested sectors. The neutral station Aurora's Cradle was the only place where diplomats could sit across a table without an orbital bombardment shattering the silence. Princess Selene was not merely a royal attendee. She was the architect of the entire peace framework, the one voice the Dominion's High Council actually respected. If she died, the Accord would die with her. That was exactly what the Dominion's intelligence arm wanted. Every species in the Allied system sent their best warriors as security. The Krell sent armored titans with gravity hammers. The Etherians deployed psionic sentinels who could detect hostile intent from 100 meters. But the human delegation sent Elias Vance. He stood barely 1.8 meters tall, weighed 70 kilos without the ceremonial load, and shuffled through the station corridors as if the air itself was trying to smother him. The other attaches mocked him openly. Even Selene's own guards pitied him, calling him the wilted banner boy. What they did not know was that the Terran diplomatic corps had spent a century deliberately cultivating that exact perception. After the Ganymede atrocity, humanity realized that being underestimated was the most powerful weapon in the galaxy. So they leaned into it. They designed robes that looked like religious vestments, massive sleeves that concealed anything you could fit inside them, layers so heavy they made a fit soldier look arthritic. And they filled every embassy, every summit, every delegation with men and women who had once cleared hostile dreadnoughts with nothing but a plasma torch and a combat knife. Elias Vance had cleared 17. He was a veteran of the Orbital Drop Shock Trooper Corps, a unit so feared that a single TODSD patch could defuse a bar fight on a dozen worlds. After 15 years of zero-gravity insertions and corridor-to-corridor purges, he retired with every joint screaming and a pension that did not stretch far on a civilian salary. The offer came from a man in a gray suit who never gave a name. The job was simple: wear the robes, look pathetic, and if anyone ever threatened the princess during a summit, make them regret their entire evolutionary lineage. Elias had trained for exactly one scenario. He never expected it to actually happen. The Viridian Death Squad was designated Void Claw 7. They were the Dominion's most decorated Black Ops unit, responsible for the assassination of 3 fleet admirals and the total annihilation of the colonial government on New Corinth. They infiltrated Aurora's Cradle through a compromised cargo airlock, bribing the dockmaster with enough credits to buy a small moon. At 0630 station time, they severed the communications relay to the diplomatic annex and silently neutralized the 2 Krell guards outside the blast door with monofilament garrots that could slice through starship hull plating. Inside the annex, Princess Selene was reviewing the final draft of the trade resolution. Elias stood beside her, breathing heavily, drenched in sweat under the 100 pounds of heavy fabric. When the door ruptured inward and 7 armored Viridian troopers flooded the compartment, Elias' hands flew up, trembling. His voice cracked. He begged for mercy, calling himself merely a protocol advisor. The Void Claw commander, a scarred veteran named Drekvas, let out a wet, gurgling laugh that echoed through the sealed room. He stepped forward to seize the princess. And in that moment, Elias Vance stopped shaking. The 100 pounds of fabric, armor, and concealed ordnance hit the deck with a sound like a starship bulkhead collapsing. The release straps were designed to shear under a specific upward twist, a motion Elias had rehearsed 10,000 times in zero-gravity simulators, and another 5,000 in his cramped apartment. The ornate sleeves tore away first, revealing forearms sheathed in carbon fiber gauntlets with monomolecular knuckle plates. The heavy outer robe split down the center, exposing a torso rig bristling with ceramic ablative plates, 2 pulse knives in magnetic sheaths, and a compact talon-pattern auto shotgun that unfolded from a collapsed state with a single flick of his right wrist. The Viridian commander, Drekvas, had exactly 2.3 seconds to register the transformation. His species, the Viridians, were apex predators, evolved from ambush hunters who relied on overwhelming shock and speed. Their doctrine assumed that any target that displayed fear was already dead, but human fear responses were different, a fact that the Dominion's military databases had simply chosen to ignore. The trembling hands, the cracked voice, the desperate begging, those were not signs of a broken prey animal. They were the trigger mechanism for a conditioned combat reflex, the human body flooding with adrenaline and cortisol in a precise cascade that sharpened synapses rather than dulling them. Elias Vance was not panicking. He was priming himself. The first trooper lunged forward, plasma rifle leveled at Selene. Elias moved before the soldier's finger could depress the firing stud. The auto shotgun barked 3 times in rapid succession, each shell loaded with a compressed tungsten flechette payload that shredded energy shielding like wet paper. The trooper's barrier flared and collapsed, and the flechettes continued through his chest plate, spraying a fine mist of vaporized scales across the bulkhead. Before the body hit the ground, Elias had already pivoted to the second target. The Viridian squad had trained for room-to-room clearance, but they had trained against other Dominion forces or allied regulars, opponents who fought with predictable positioning and standard firing arcs. Elias Vance did neither. He moved through the confined annex in a pattern that tactical analysts later described as geometrically impossible. He used the walls as launch surfaces, his magnetic boot grips engaging momentarily to let him spring sideways at obtuse angles. The heavy ceremonial robes had concealed not just the weapons, but the servos in his knee braces, combat-rated augments that boosted his acceleration to nearly 12 meters per second squared from a standing start. But here's the thing. The Viridians were not incompetent. Void Claw 7 had executed over 40 high-value targets without a single casualty. They had killed generals, admirals, and planetary governors. What they had never faced was an opponent who had spent his entire career training to fight in exactly this scenario. A sealed room, outnumbered, with a single asset to protect and 0 chance of reinforcement. Elias had lived this nightmare 100 times in simulation, and twice in reality. Once on a hijacked passenger liner over Proxima, and once in the bowels of a derelict cruiser infested with rogue combat drones. Each time, the math was the same. Eliminate the most immediate threat, exploit the geometry, and never let the enemy regroup. The 3rd and 4th troopers attempted to form a defensive line behind an overturned conference table. Elias dove over the table, triggering a pair of kinetic breaching charges that he had palmed from a hidden pouch during the initial standoff. He slapped the charges onto the table's underside mid-flight, landed in a roll, and detonated them before the Viridians could react. The table disintegrated into a cloud of shrapnel that shredded their barriers and sent them staggering backward. Elias rose through the debris, pulse knife already drawn, and opened both troopers' throat seals in a single fluid motion. Princess Selene pressed herself against the far wall, her diplomatic training screaming at her to seek cover while her combat instincts, honed through years of self-defense drills, demanded she find a weapon. She watched the creature she had pitied for 3 years transform into something she could barely process. Every movement Elias made was economical, brutal, and utterly silent except for the roar of the shotgun and the wet percussion of blades striking scale. He did not shout battle cries or issue commands. He simply killed, one trooper after another, with the detached efficiency of a factory machine that had been retasked to dismantle meat. The 5th Veridian, the squad's communications officer, tried to retreat toward the blown door. Elias intercepted him with a flying tackle, wrapping his legs around the trooper's torso and driving both gauntleted fists into the base of the alien's skull with a sickening double crack. They hit the floor together, and only Elias stood back up. In 34 seconds, 6 of the 7 members of Void Claw 7 were dead. The annex walls, once a pristine white, were now streaked with dark orange fluid and scorch marks from plasma bursts that had missed their targets. The air reeked of ozone, charred meat, and the acrid tang of burnt metal. And in the center of the carnage stood Elias Vance, breathing hard, his robes shredded, the combat rig now fully exposed under the harsh emergency lighting. He looked less like a diplomat and more like a god of war who had been stuffed into a very uncomfortable costume for far too long. Selene finally found her voice. It came out as a whisper, but in the sudden silence it carried. You were never an attaché." Elias turned to face her, the auto shotgun still smoking in his grip. His eyes, which for 3 years had seemed sunken and exhausted, now held a clarity that was almost frightening. "Your Highness, I've been a lot of things." Protocol Advisor was the most boring. He ejected the spent magazine from the shotgun and slammed home a fresh one with a practiced motion. "We need to move. This was just the first wave." But the commander, Drekvas, was not dead. He had been thrown against a support strut when Elias detonated the conference table, his left arm shattered and his rifle lost, but he was alive. And now, from the floor, he began to laugh. It was a wet, gurgling sound distorted by the damage to his respiratory slits. "You think you've won, human?" he rasped, pushing himself up on one elbow. His eyes, 4 of them arranged in a diamond pattern, fixed on Elias with murderous hatred. "You have no idea what you just set in motion. The Dominion will broadcast this. They will show the galaxy that human diplomats are assassins. Your precious summit is over. The war will never end." Elias walked over to the crippled commander and crouched down, his gauntlets still slick with alien blood. He looked into Drekvas's eyes, and for a moment the mask of the exhausted attaché flickered back into place. But this time it was terrifying, because now Selene knew what lay beneath it. "No," Elias said quietly. "You'll deliver a different message." He stood, grabbed the commander by the collar of his ruined armor, and began dragging him toward the Annex's primary broadcast console. The summit's live feed was still active, the emergency override locking it on for every delegation on Aurora's cradle to witness. "You're going to tell the galaxy exactly what happens when the Dominion sends death squads into a diplomatic negotiation. And when you're done, you're going to tell them that Earth's patience is not weakness. It is a weapon, and we have been holding it for a very long time." Selene watched, her heart hammering, as Elias accessed the console with a command code he had no business knowing. The feed was about to go galaxy-wide, and whatever message the Viridian commander delivered, it would either save the fragile peace accord or ignite a war that would consume every star system from the core to the fringe. The broadcast console hummed to life, its holoscreen flickering once before locking onto the emergency override channel. Elias Vance did not hesitate. He keyed in a 12-digit authorization code that was classified above the highest clearance levels of the Allied system's diplomatic corps. Princess Selene stared at him, her mind racing to understand how a man who had spent 3 years pretending to fumble with datapads now navigated a military-grade encryption layer as if he had written the firmware himself. She didn't know the full truth yet. Elias Vance had never truly left the orbital drop shock troopers. He had been recruited into the Obsidian Protocol, a covert human intelligence program that embedded retired Special Forces operators into diplomatic postings across the galaxy. Every exhausted attaché, every clumsy junior aide, every forgettable human trailing behind a senior ambassador. Some of them were waiting, always waiting, for exactly this moment. The broadcast went live across every channel on the Aurora's cradle. Delegates from 37 species, negotiators, aides, and billions watching over relay streams saw a blood-spattered human in shredded ceremonial robes standing over a crippled Viridian commander. Selene stepped into the frame behind him, her presence making it clear this was not a coup but a rescue. Elias hauled Drekvas upright by his shattered arm. The Viridian screamed, a guttural sound that silenced every corridor on the station. "Tell them," Elias said, his voice flat and cold. "Tell them what Void Claw 7 was sent to do." Drekvas's 4 eyes flicked to the camera, and for the first time in his career he felt genuine fear. Not of death, his species did not fear death. He feared what his own failure would cost the Dominion. The Viridian commander hissed and spat, but the words came. "We were ordered to execute the princess on live broadcast so that the peace accord would shatter." He paused, then sneered. "But you have no proof." "The Dominion High Council will deny everything. This broadcast will be dismissed as human propaganda." Elias leaned in close, his face filling the screen. "You think I need proof? I have the dead bodies. I have your squad's armor, their combat logs, the transmissions you sent back to your command ship. I have everything, and I'm sending it right now to every delegation on this station. The Dominion's fingerprints are all over this. But that's not the worst part, Drekvas. Tell them about the second team." The silence that followed was so absolute that Selene could hear the blood dripping from Elias' gauntlet onto the deck plates. Drekvas's expression shifted from defiance to horror. You couldn't know about that." "I know that Void Claw 7 was just the distraction," Elias said, loud enough for every microphone to pick it up. "I know that while your squad was supposed to kill the princess, a second team was infiltrating the station's environmental core with enough neurotoxin to kill every living being on Aurora's cradle. That was the real plan. Decapitate the human leadership, frame the Dominion's hardliners, and then wipe out the entire summit in a single stroke. No witnesses, no survivors, total war." Drekvas convulsed, his respiratory slits fluttering in panic. Who told you this?" "One of your own," Elias said, and at that moment the door to the annex slid open. Standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 human special operators in full combat gear, was Viridian Consul Varin. The consul was the Dominion's senior diplomat at the summit, a moderate who had secretly been negotiating a separate peace with the Allied systems for months. He had been the source of the intelligence that the hit was coming. And he had just watched his own government attempt to murder him along with everyone else on the station. "The High Council's radical faction authorized the strike without my knowledge," Varin said into the camera, his voice trembling with rage. "They used my security codes to bypass the station's defenses. I stand with the humans. The Dominion must be purged of this madness." The broadcast was now a political earthquake. On the Dominion homeworld, hardliners in the High Council were already being arrested by loyalist forces. But the chaos was only beginning. Out in the neutral zone, a Viridian dreadnought, the Infinite Reach, had been waiting for confirmation that the summit was destroyed. Its captain, a zealot named Threx, saw the broadcast and decided to act before the High Council could countermand his orders. He launched a full wing of assault shuttles toward Aurora's cradle. The station's defensive grid was still compromised. There were 67,000 sentient beings aboard. They had 14 minutes before the shuttles docked and the massacre began. Elias saw the incoming trajectory on a secondary monitor. He tapped his earpiece. "Control, this is Vance. I read 12 assault shuttles inbound. ETA to station breach." A voice crackled back, belonging to a woman who had been his handler for the past 8 years. 13.5 minutes. "The Obsidian Protocol is activating. Reinforcements are scrambling from the Fifth Fleet, but they're 22 minutes out." "Might as well be a month," Elias muttered. He turned to Selene. "Your Highness, I need you to listen carefully. The station's emergency broadcast just bought us some time, but that dreadnought out there, its captain doesn't care about politics. He wants to kill everyone and blame it on a human attack. We need to hold the station until the fleet arrives." Selene, still weak from adrenaline shock, squared her shoulders. She was the architect of the peace accord, but she was also a trained diplomat who had spent years negotiating with warlords and terrorists. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Elias smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "I need you to get on every remaining channel and rally the delegations. Not to fight, but to barricade themselves in the central chamber. If those shuttles dock, they'll sweep for the easiest targets. We bottleneck them at the core." He turned to Consul Varin. "And you, your security codes still work on the station's internal defenses." Varin nodded slowly. "I can activate the automated turrets. They're limited, but they'll slow the assault shuttles down." "Do it. Then get to the command center. Tell them to shunt all non-critical power to the docking bay airlocks. We're going to vent them to space if necessary." The pieces were moving now. The station's sirens began to wail. Across Aurora's cradle, diplomats who had been arguing over trade quotas minutes ago were now shoving tables against doors and arming themselves with ceremonial sidearms they had never expected to use. But Elias knew the hard truth. 12 assault shuttles full of Viridian zealots would overwhelm any improvised defense. The only way to truly save the station was to make the Infinite Reach stand down, and that meant a boarding action. He turned to his two human reinforcements, the operators who had accompanied Consul Varin. "How fast can you get me to the hangar bay?" One of them, a woman with a scar across her scalp, grinned. 90 seconds if we take the maintenance shafts." Elias stripped off the remains of his ceremonial robes, leaving only the combat rig. "Good. I need a breaching pod, a tac nuke, and a direct line to the 5th Fleet Admiral. Tell him I'm about to gift him a dreadnought." Selene grabbed his arm as he moved toward the door. "You can't board a Viridian dreadnought alone. That's suicide." Elias paused, and for a moment the exhausted protocol advisor flickered back in his eyes. "Princess, I've spent 15 years training for suicide missions. This is just another day at the office." He gently removed her hand. "But if I don't come back, make sure the galaxy remembers what happened here. Don't let the peace die with me." Then he was gone, the two operators flanking him as they sprinted toward the maintenance shafts. The station shuddered as the first assault shuttle tried to force a docking clamp on the outer ring. Time was running out. The fate of 67,000 lives now rested on a single scavenged breaching pod, a stolen tac nuke, and a man who had once been the most underestimated diplomat in the galaxy. And somewhere in the cold void between the station and the advancing shuttles, a plan was forming in Elias Vance's mind. A plan that would either end the Dominion's reign of terror forever or turn him into the very thing he had spent his life fighting: a monster. The breaching pod was a coffin-shaped hunk of durasteel with a jury-rigged propulsion system that had been used to smuggle contraband, not board dreadnoughts. Elias Vance strapped himself into the crash webbing, the tac nuke secured in a shielded compartment beneath his seat. The plan was simple: launch from the station's underbelly, ride the compression wave of a decoy torpedo salvo, and punch through the infinite reaches, hangar bay shields before the gunners could recalibrate. The odds of survival were less than 12%. To Elias, that was a luxury. On his third deployment, the odds had been 2%. He was still here. The pod screamed out of the launch tube, its compensators straining against the sudden acceleration. Through the tiny viewport, Elias watched the station recede, a glittering crescent of metal and light, so fragile against the black. The Viridian assault shuttles were already halfway across the gap, bristling with weapons and boarding clamps. They didn't even register the pod. It was too small, too fast, and flying straight toward the dreadnought that had birthed them. The captain of the Infinite Reach, Threx, was so fixated on the station assault that he never considered a counterboarding action. His tactical scans flagged the pod as debris. A fatal mistake. The pod slammed into the hangar bay hull, breaching charges detonating in sequence to carve a hole through the outer plating. The interior depressurized instantly, sucking 3 Viridian deck crew into the void before emergency force fields kicked in. Elias emerged from the pod with the shotgun already raised, his mag boots securing him to the blood-slicked deck. The hangar was chaos, technicians scrambling, alarm klaxons blaring, but the element of surprise was total. Elias moved through the bay with practiced precision, eliminating the token resistance and sealing the blast doors behind him. He didn't need to kill everyone. He just needed to reach the bridge. He made it in 7 minutes, 23 Viridians dead, 12 incapacitated. The shotgun ran dry and he switched to the pulse knives, then to a scavenged plasma rifle when the knives became too slick to grip. The Dreadnought's internal layout was standard Dominion design, which meant Elias had memorized it years ago. The bridge was sealed behind a meter-thick blast door, but the tac nuke served as a universal key. Elias planted it against the door's locking mechanism, set the timer for 5 minutes and stepped back. The door melted. The bridge crew, hardened veterans all, turned to face him with weapons drawn. Elias stood in the gap, silhouetted by the molten glow, the nuke's thermal casing still smoking. He raised his hands, not in surrender but in a gesture of negotiation. "Captain Threx," he called out, his voice carrying across the stunned silence. "I have a tactical nuclear device strapped to your reactor core. My Deadman switch is linked to my heartbeat. If I die, this ship becomes a minor star. But I'm not here to kill you. I'm here to offer you a choice." Threx, a massive Viridian with ritual scarification covering every visible inch of scale, rose from his command throne. "You are one human. You expect me to believe you could do this." Elias pointed to the console, where a blinking red indicator showed an unauthorized breaching charge had indeed been placed on the primary reactor casing. "I don't expect anything. I'm just telling you the facts. You have 2 minutes to recall your shuttles and stand down, or we all become very, very warm." The bridge crew froze. Threx's 4 eyes flicked between the human and the reactor alert. He was a zealot but not a fool. "You would not sacrifice yourself. Humans are not that selfless." Elias laughed, a sound that had no humor in it. "You've been reading the wrong intelligence reports, Captain. I was trained to die so others could live. That's the core of human warfare. We're the species that runs into burning buildings, that drowns itself to push a stranger to shore, that charges machine gun nests to save a single comrade. I've been dead since I signed up. The question is, are you willing to die with me?" On the station, Princess Selene watched through a tactical feed as the assault shuttles suddenly decelerated, their boarding clamps retracting. She saw the Dreadnought's weapons power down, its shields flickering into a passive configuration. A message arrived over the emergency channel. "This is Captain Threx, commanding officer of the Infinite Reach. We are standing down. All hostile actions are rescinded. I am surrendering my vessel to the human operative who stands on my bridge." And then, after a pause, "Tell the galaxy that a single human in torn robes just ended a war." The Fifth Fleet arrived 22 minutes later as promised, but they found no battle to join. The Infinite Reach sat silent, its crew disarmed and its captain in custody. The station's delegates flooded back into the corridors, embracing one another in a mix of terror and relief. Selene rushed to the hangar bay to meet the shuttle that returned Elias Vance to Aurora's cradle. He stepped out limping, his combat rig blackened and torn, but he was alive. His eyes, though, were different now. The fierce clarity had given way to a deep weariness, not the exhaustion of the hunted, but the peace of a man who had finally put down a weight he'd carried for decades. He had not detonated the nuke. The Deadman switch was a bluff. The device was unarmed. But Threx never needed to know that. What mattered was the choice. The Viridian captain had chosen to preserve his crew over his pride, and in doing so, he had broken the Dominion's cycle of violence. Peace accord was signed 3 days later with Consul Varin as the Dominion's new representative. Elias was offered medals, promotions, a permanent place in the history books. He declined all of them. "I'm just a protocol advisor," he said with a weak smile. "Get me some new robes, the old ones didn't survive the trip." And somewhere deep in the classified archives of the Obsidian Protocol, a final note was added to his file. "Subject Vance Elias. Status: active. Mission concluded." Note, he was never just a shield, he was the message. The galaxy had spent a century cataloging human strengths, our adaptability, our aggression, our reckless courage. But they consistently missed the one that mattered most, our ability to stand perfectly still until the right moment. Elias Vance was not an exception. He was a template. In the years following the Aurora Concordance, 17 more Obsidian Protocol operatives activated across embassies and trade summits, each one hidden in plain sight, each one a diplomatic attaché, a cultural secretary, a tired-looking protocol advisor who never spoke out of turn. The Dominion never attempted another assassination. The peace held, fragile and imperfect, but held. And when historians looked back at the turning point, they did not point to the dreadnought's surrender or the signing ceremony. They pointed to a single moment, a human in ornate robes, trembling hands raised, begging for mercy. That performance had ended a 32-year war. The lesson was simple. In a universe that equates loudness with power, the quiet ones are always the most dangerous. So the next time you see someone shuffling through a corridor, weighed down by what looks like useless tradition, remember that you might be looking at a message Earth has not yet delivered. If this story of hidden strength and impossible odds resonated with you, please smash that like button, share with a fellow sci-fi fan, and subscribe with notifications on for more epic original tales from the stars. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and never underestimate the quiet ones.